Here's something. A thought occurred to me recently. Are we done with mini consoles? It hit me just as I got the TurboGrafx Mini, and at the time it felt like a genuine inquiry. Now, let me rephrase this better. Are the major companies done with mini consoles? Mini consoles or repackaged standalones have been around since the early to mid 2000s, but they've only become a popular trend in the second half of the 2010s. By this point, it seemed that we had all the popular 4th gen consoles accounted for, but then Sega announced the Game Gear Mini, and it's also announced the Astro City Mini, all as part of its 60th year anniversary, which begs to ask the question, what is the longevity for the mini console market? I'm certain that fans of these devices have speculated since the very beginning. It wasn't too long after the release of the NES Classic that people were already anticipating an SNES Mini or an N64 Mini. Now, whether you were swept up in the excitement of the mini consoles or just dismissed them as a fad, I can honestly say that it's a trend that's already lasted longer than what I initially gave it credit for. And it's come to include a few consoles that I wouldn't have expected to. So I ask, is the demand for them still present? Are companies winding down production? And quite frankly, are they becoming a harder sell? The short of it is, I don't know. But seeing as we're 4 years in and they're still being made, I thought it'd be nice to go back and examine what the big appeal was and what the pros and cons have been, and ultimately speculate what the future might entail. Now, as for the appeal, it doesn't get any more plain and simple than nostalgia. Nostalgia sells, and the timing couldn't have been more perfect. See, by 2016, the retro gaming collection scene had already started to pick up with both gamers and non-gamers alike who started to see that there was value in their old games. But you know what started to fade away? CRTs. I'm sure you've all plugged in an older console to your modern TV and noticed it either scales poorly, the video fidelity looks harsh and fuzzy, etc. This is of course all because your older consoles relied on either RF or composite video, which are two of the worst video sources available. Now, this of course depends on where in the world you grew up, because some regions had RGB, and this isn't even without going into the technicals of NTSC or PAL. So, you could either bear with the video fidelity issue, or if you want to play these games on a modern screen with more clarity, this more or less limited your options to either going with emulation, which was the more common of routes, or investing into high-end upscalers like the FrameMeister, or high-end clone consoles like the Analog NT, which output through HDMI. But those options are almost strictly for die-hard enthusiasts that like their genuine hardware and games. So yeah, those who grew up with both original hardware and emulation may have not realized that the reason your emulator looked nicer was because your originals were running through a heavily compressed signal designed to be formatted for 4x3 TVs with scan lines. I bring this up because the minis capitalized on convenience. They outputted to 720p, they retained the original aspect ratio, and often gave you the option to adjust to pixel perfect, and, if you're a monster, even stretched into widescreen. But even disregarding just the question of video fidelity, what about the cost of original hardware and games in the secondhand market? Demand has gone up more and more, with people wanting to revisit classic games, but supply has not, and vendors have taken notice. The chances of picking up an NES and a shoebox full of games for less than $20 is gone. Not in the day of eBay. The minis have, for the most part, included the most sought after games of its platforms. Emphasis on for the most part. It's all emulated, of course, but again, the biggest selling point was the fact that the companies went the extra mile to not only recreate a downsized model of the original systems, but also the controllers, the original packaging, etc. People like nostalgia. It's why Pepsi and Coke sell throwback cans and original bottled sodas. Now, I was fairly reluctant when it came to jumping on to the mini console train myself. I thought the initial announcement of the NES Classic to be interesting, but ultimately not something I would buy. I think what swept me up into buying the NES Classic were my memories of amiibos, and the infamous shortages that they suffered, which basically taught me that if I had any remote interest in the product and I wasn't hurting for cash, buy it. My instinct proved well, and voila, I got an NES Classic. I recall I lined up outside of a Target on my day off, and I remember very specifically that they only had 21 units. Why? because I was number 21 in line and I got the very last one in the store. The NES Classic is generally considered the best of the mini consoles. For one, its library is undeniably the closest to perfect among all the minis. It highlights the quintessential games of that generation like the original Mario trilogy, Zelda 1 and 2, Metroid, along with cult classics like Star Tropics and Dr. Mario. The general quality and attention put into the package is extraordinary. However, it isn't without its own set of flaws. For one, the controller cord length is probably the most egregious. It is infamously short because Nintendo had designed it with the intention that people would be sitting right up to the console, just like they had with the original Famicom. Since the controller is a one-to-one recreation of the original NES ones, there is no home button placed. Instead, you have to rely on the reset button on the Mini itself, which is both cute, but at the same time, way less than ideal, especially if you went out of your way to invest in extension cord cables. Now, this issue is resolved if you bought a wireless controller, and it isn't an issue if you used a Wii Classic controller, as Nintendo just repurposed the same cable lens from the Wii accessories.
Good luck!
But from there, I instinctively followed suit to pick up the SNES Mini when it was announced, and thought, okay, I'm done. I got 2 consoles I wanted, that's it. The SNES is more or less the same level of quality that Nintendo brought with the last entry with some improvements. For one, they included 2 controllers out of the box, and the cables are of decent length, thankfully. A huge problem that many consumers ran into when trying to find an additional first-party NES controller was that they were hard to find in the system itself. Second improvement, the rewind feature. Say what you will about this feature and how it compromises the integrity of gaming, I still think it was a fun feature, especially for those who wanted to memorize patterns in games that aren't so forgiving. Lastly, it marked the first official playable appearance of Star Fox 2. Now I stress official as yes, the ROM itself had made its way through the internet via prototype builds, but it's a nice bonus. It was later brought to the Switch once again, which, cool. So following this, people speculated that an N64 Mini would be coming up and started to dream up lists. As of the time of this video, that is yet to happen. Instead, other companies jumped onto the train.
Here comes a new challenger!
In 2018, SNK and Sony both jumped onto the bandwagon, and their approaches to the mini console were interesting, for both better and worse. When SNK announced the NeoGeo Mini, which is actually shaped like a miniature candy cab with a functioning screen and stick, it certainly made it the most unique of the recent offerings, simply in terms of appearance and functionality. SNK even went as far as producing variants of the Mini. I personally own the international one, but Japan and the United States also got their own dedicated releases, which are a bit more colorful and aesthetically pleasing than this one. On top of that, they also made Samurai Showdown NeoGeos. Important thing to note is that the variants are more than just a change in the paint job. They also include a slightly different library of games, with some releases catering more towards the fighting game library and the international one attempting to create a more balanced list. I simply grabbed the international release due to a relatively recent price drop, and I also grew up with a lot of SNK games and the library looked fantastic, at least from this perspective. That said, I have some complaints about the NeoGeo Mini. For one, it requires you to have an HDMI mini adapter if you're hoping to play this on your TV, and it does not come included in the box. The packaging in general is actually pretty sparse. If I recall correctly, it only comes in with the unit and a single USB-C cable, no power adapter is included. Using the onboard stick on the unit is a nice novelty, but don't expect to do very well in the classic SNK fighter using it. The controllers themselves are sold separately, and they feel quite nice. I have read that the reproduction controllers don't recreate the original micro-switch clickiness that the original ones had, but I don't have a good point of reference to those, and in my opinion, okay! Now, how are the games? Well, again, they vary based on which release you got, but I think they struck a very fine balance here, especially considering the fact that the SNK arcade library already leans heavily on fighting games. This is something that I would come to expect from them. My last gripe, outside of the emulation quality, is the rather cheap looking UI that is included in the firmware. It's serviceable, but in comparison to what Nintendo's offerings were, they lack charm. But, you know, it's fine. You could always do worse. I actually had a pre-order of the PlayStation Classic that I am glad I canceled in retrospect, because this product was not worth the $100 it came out to retail for. From the get-go, this product came in controversial fashion. For one, during its announcement, they only showed off 5 of the 20 games, all in an effort to create hype and speculation, and upon the reveal of the actual full list is when people actually started to lose interest. The PlayStation Classic's library screams loss of potential. While they certainly secured prime choices with Final Fantasy VII, Metal Gear Solid, Tekken 3, and the like, they also included games like Destruction Derby and Battle Arena Toshinden. By the way, I will still defend the inclusion of Cool Borders 2, so don't get me started. Now, in all fairness, it is a difficult task to compile a list of generation-defining classics all in one package. You're bound to exclude some because of either licensing issues or by the simple fact that you're paring it down to a small, concise number of 20. None of these minis, even the successful ones, are free of that criticism. But the PlayStation's lineup is marred by a lot of unfortunate circumstances, namely timing. One of the most notable absences was Crash Bandicoot, but there's a good reason for that. The Insane Trilogy was already out for over a year, and people had already revisited the classic games, this time with a new fancy coat of paint, and even on other platforms by the Switch at that point. So, that's out. But what about Symphony of the...
Die, monster! You don't belong in this world!
So, yeah, that's just one game though. As long as the emulation is good, then it should be It's time to talk about emulation. So, yeah. I've avoided talking about emulation quality for the bulk of the video, but it's kind of unavoidable, and I'll reiterate my previous statement. None of these minis are free from emulation issues. People first noted it with Punch-Out on the NES that the emulation and the upscaling created lag, which made it very difficult to do some of the dodges in that game. And the NeoGeo Mini actually has some notable sound issues, along with some visual garbling. The PlayStation also has emulation quality issues, with regards to how sound can oftentimes enter slowdown during gameplay. The visual fidelity is questionable as it attempts to smoothen out some of the rough edges by blurring out the dithering and pixelation effects of the original game's presentation. It's all further worsened by the baffling decision to use European ISOs on some of its games. Without going into crazy detail, due to PAL, older games ran at 50 Hz instead of the native 60 Hz that all American and Japanese games ran at. So, if you picked this up on day one and were unaware of this, and you happen to boot, say, Tekken 3, you were met with a significantly less fluid experience, to say the least. Some would argue an unplayable version of one of the best fighting games of that generation. So, why do I have this? I enjoyed the novelty of having many replicas of the very first 3 consoles I ever owned, warts and all. I thought it would make for an interesting piece. I mean, it is a mini that incites memories of nostalgia through its physical presentation, but you know what helped? As the backlash rained down on the PlayStation Classic, stores saw themselves getting flooded with unmoving stock, and the price came down low enough for me to sink the money into it. Note that this will become a trend. It even affects the next entry here, the Genesis. I once had a conversation with someone at my old job. They asked, why should I get the Mini when this other one has more games on it and it can read my old games? The other one he was referring to was an AtGames flashback console. As many might already know, there's been officially licensed reproduction Genesis models for years now, but they've been of infamous poor quality as they're all manufactured by a third-party company, AtGames, an American-based company that has become rather notorious with their slap-together flashback consoles. The Genesis Mini was originally announced to be produced by AtGames, but following the public scrutiny, Sega loaded the task over to M2, a studio who already had credibility due to their previous porting efforts of other classic Sega games. It definitely seems that this decision was to avoid having their own PlayStation Classic disaster, and for the most part, the Genesis Mini is quite the nice package. The game library is quite nice, the controllers feel good, the USB cable even has the little Sega logo, and what's this? It has a functioning dust cover? Man, that's great stuff. If only you could plug in a Mini 32X into... Yeah, Sega made this accessory, and I want it. They definitely gave this product a more loving touch than Sony's effort, which sadly comes off as a cash grab. Arguably, all the Minis are cash grabs, but when done well, they're a loving ode to the past. My only complaint, aside from some audio delays here in the emulation, I think it would have been nice if Sega would have included some Sega CD games, so that people can experience the only English release of Snatcher, a beloved classic. If only there was a Mini that had Snatcher on it, I would totally buy it. Snatcher is here, but it ain't in English. So here's the latest entry into the collection, the one that started this whole video arguably, the TurboGrafx Mini. I can't talk about the release of this without mentioning that this Mini was an Amazon exclusive, and its original American launch window was pushed back due to COVID-19. My overall thoughts? Again, it's a nice package, but like any of the Minis, I have some gripes. First of all, it's not very mini to begin with. I don't have an original TurboGrafx 16 for reference, but this Mini is about the size of an original Famicom, and it just looks huge when lined up with the others. So for those that like having them all lined up and nice, this one just sticks out. I'm also not fond of the micro USB slot. I can see what they were trying to do by clicking the wire into the grooves and plugging the USB in, but it's just a pain in the ass. There's barely any room for the micro USB end, and maneuvering it into the slot is just annoying because of the limited amount of space. I literally just left it plugged in the entire time to avoid having to deal with it. The controller is okay, it has the original turbo switches, but it does feel a bit stiff at times, so all in all it's not my favorite, but it is true to the original design, which I appreciate. As far as the game selection, it caters largely to shoot 'em ups, with some niche games here and there, such as the original Splatterhouse, one of the best versions of Ghosts and Goblins, and even one of my favorites, East Books 1 and 2. One of the things I love the most about this Mini was the presentation of the UI. I love the fact that they went as far as including the Japanese versions of some of the games, even Turbo CD and Super Graphics games. It's quite varied, but it does make me wish that some of these exclusive games were in English, but they also kind of help out by including some secret games in there, so you can always be on the lookout for those. All in all, I found the Minis to be quite a neat trend in the world of video game collecting, but it does seem that the appeal of them is waning, as all the popular consoles have been accounted for. When discussing this topic with some of my friends, the general census seems to be that the quality and the appeal trend downwards. The fact that just about all the Minis after the SNES dropped in price seems to lend credence to this. The one exception is the TurboGrafx Mini, but that had more of a limited appeal, had exclusivity, and it didn't come out at the most convenient time. As it stands, Sega is releasing 2 more mini consoles, so while they might be slowing down, there's still a chance that we'll be seeing more throwbacks over time. After all, nostalgia always sells, it's just a matter of time that really allows for it to capitalize. Because as time moves forward, everything eventually becomes nostalgic to somebody, right?